to On the Spot podcast. I am here with Patrick and John. We are talking about Edgar Allan Poe, one of the more influential poet writers, Gothic fiction writers. I want to kind of get your ideas upon what makes this guy so influential. John, can we start with you?
Sure. So Edgar Allan Poe, for me, is one of the first writers I remember reading. Definitely one of the first writers who wasn't just like in the children's section or something my parents handed me and said, hey, read this, it's good for you. And I think that is partly because he's so accessible, partly because the writing is so imaginative, so fascinating, holds people spellbound. And I think that is all part of the reason he's so influential and so important. He taps into something that is fascinating and sort of deep inside every person, and he does it in a way that is very vivid and just engages with really great storytelling. All this stuff we teach, like suspense, symbolism, unreliable narrator, setting and atmosphere, he engages with all of that in a really, really powerful way. So he's just a good, skillful writer. But beyond that, it's also his subject matter, which is very dark and fascinating, psychologically complicated. And it's also, he was an innovator. He was doing things that we take as commonplace now, like the whole genre of horror fiction, Gothic fiction, sci-fi, supernatural stuff, detective fiction. That stuff didn't exist so much before Poe, and he in some way created or contributed to creating all of that.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what John said about Poe being an innovator, because I feel like we almost take it for granted that we've always had this type of detective fiction and, Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. If there's no Poe, there's probably no Sherlock Holmes, the detective fiction. And Poe's ability to internalize Gothic fiction. Whereas before, in England, we had a lot of stories, you had novels like Frankenstein and Dracula and supernatural figures, ghosts and goblins and supernatural figures, whereas Poe would take an ordinary person, well, maybe not ordinary, but a person that might have had psychological problems and show the psychology of a deranged killer. Like, bring us inside the mind of somebody that is a killer. And, I think there's a huge fascination. For example, a lot of times I'll go on Netflix and I'll see some of the most popular shows, and they're detective shows or they're shows about serial killers, and it shows that people are really fascinated with the dark side of psychology, dark part of human nature. And this genre didn't really exist before Poe. And that's one of the reasons why he's such a significant writer and why he's studied around the world and taught all around the world.
So for a lot of our 10th grade students, the only absorption we got of Edgar Allan Poe may be Telltale Hearts that we kind of looked at in 10th grade. But what is that story that you think really resonated with you? Your favorite Edgar Allan Poe story. John, we'll start with you.
So the first one, and it's one of the most vivid memories of reading anything I ever had, is The Mask of the Red Death. So this is a very bizarre, horrifying story full of color, full of symbolism, full of ceremony, full of decadence. If you haven't read the story, it basically involves plague, very appropriately for our current setting, a disease that is ravaging Europe, and a prince who decides to shut himself and his friends up in a castle and essentially hold a huge ball, a huge party, while the rest of the world is dying around them. There are rooms that are color-coded. There is a mysterious masked figure who represents this plague and perhaps death itself, who sort of dances or moves in a ceremonious unstoppable way from room to room. And it's not what happens, but how it's described. And the imagery, that the sort of nightmarish movie that this put inside my young head, even though I didn't understand all of the words, even though I maybe didn't understand 100% what was going on, that made this so vivid and unforgettable, and kind of made me realize the magic of words. Something about the obscurity of it, the complex nature of what he was doing, made it more vivid than a more simplistic story where I understood all of it. It felt like I was kind of tapping into this imaginative space that I discovered to me much broader and wider and more fascinating and in some ways more terrifying than I realized it had been prior to that. And that got me started on a lot of other reading.
Patrick, I give it to you. Your most inspirational story.
So for Poe, and I actually assigned this story. We're reading this week. It's The Cask of Amontillado, and I really love this story. I hope my students like it as much as me. But although I will admit, the first time I read it, I didn't connect with it as much as I do now. So if you're out there and you're one of my students, like, don't worry, maybe you'll connect with it later. But
I'll connect with you.
basically, the reason why this is such an interesting story, it kind of touches upon what I said earlier, where it's not supernatural. It talks about a person that is. It's also different from the Telltale Heart, where the Telltale Heart, I feel like the narrator is a crazy person, pretty insane. But this person is very intellectual. They're very organized. They also like to play with language, even while they're baiting. While Montresor is baiting his victim Fortunato into his death, he's still playing with language. So there's a dark humor that's present in this story. So it's one of my favorites because it's a simple plot. It's somebody it's a narrator that's about to narrating his murder of another person, but it's such an interesting story because of the narrator's discussion of what he's going to do and his puns and play on words throughout the story, and it shows that internalized Gothic fiction. So that's one of the reasons why The Cask of Amontillado is such a really important story to me, one of the ones that I really like. I do like a lot of them. What do you think, Mr. Tony? What's your favorite Poe story? Or poem?
All right, so kind of cliche, but my favorite poem is The Raven. This was the first poem that got me fixated on poetry in general. I first encountered it through The Simpsons when I watched that episode, the reenaction of Homer and Bart as the crow,
Raven.
as the Raven himself, right? And it was these darker underlinings of humanity, the soul, the regret that we feel, the part of the self that we naturally want to reject. The part of the self that's crucified by society, and being able to kind of explore that in a artistic and academic way. And I think that's what Gothic fiction is all about, touching upon these taboos that otherwise we would be a little bit uncomfortable in expressing, but in terms of poetry, it works.
All right, so let's switch gears. We talked about our favorite Poe piece of work. Let's just maybe have a discussion about Poe's life, because there's a lot of mystery involving his life. Where should we start, Mr. John?
Well, let's not start with his death, but let's foreshadow his death because of as in a very Poe style. We know we're all going there eventually.
Yes.
Not to bring the tone down, but yeah, we're all headed straight to the grave, is what I'm saying, and we should all be conscious of that. Is what Poe tells us.
Do we talk about his life?
Yeah, we should talk about his life.
Okay.
So, some of the controversial stuff about Poe. How about we start here? We think his work is great. Are there people who don't think so?
Yes, there are people that, especially during his time, because I think it's important. It's important to note that Poe never really he reached his ultimate fame after he died.
Yeah.
He never became rich. One of the reasons was because he had a gambling problem and an alcohol problem, but he never became rich. He never became super famous until after he died. So there are people that dismissed his work as almost like we dismiss horror movies today. A lot of like people dismiss the artistic merit of horror movies. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, basically there are trends that go in and out of style with literature, and they can be kind of harsh. And he was kind of riding the wave for a while of this very elaborate, mannered, highly emotional, highly symbolic style that was never everyone's cup of tea, but that he really pushed to its extremes and influenced a lot of people, but also alienated people who weren't really into it. Some people will even criticize his work today by saying, oh, it's kind of adolescent because it's so emotional, because it's so sensationalized. But actually, like you said, Mr. Patrick, he has a sense of humor. So he's very aware of all of these things, and he's ironic. He's playing with these kinds of tropes self-consciously. And yeah, I mean, it's still controversial because of this idea of genre, of horror, of suspense. You know, should we take that seriously? But I think the culture today has shifted much more towards pop culture and genre being embraced. So I think that's part of the reason Poe has become and remained much more popular after his death. But we should also note it's hard to get by as a writer anytime. It's not easy to get rich. So,
Yeah, but I also think in every generation you're going to have forms of literature that it brings it into question what is literature. So like before in the 90s you had graphic novels, what is it? The like Batman series, Mouse, The Watchmen, and we bring it into question. Well, is this worth studying? Is this an actual form of literature that represents the time it's in? The current discussion involves like video games at this point. Can video games present a literary form of art? And as you said before, I think Poe was writing a very new revolutionary type of work, something darker, something more sensational that people brought into that question, is it worth studying?
Yeah. Another thing about Poe's life is his personal life. As you mentioned, he perhaps had an alcohol problem, a gambling problem. So it's a kind of dark romantic life as well as dark romantic writing, kind of pushing himself to these extremes of desperation, and then we see that reflected in his work, in the work of madmen and men who are on the brink of some kind of emotional breakdown.
Cask of Amontillado has a lot to do with alcohol. I mean, the title is a barrel of wine. So, and I was going to talk about it when I talked about Cask, but the fact that like it could be symbolic of alcohol being someone's downfall, and what is Montresor as a figure? Does Montresor potentially represent alcoholism as bringing Fortunato down, who is like a drunk? I don't know, just something, food for thought for my class, especially.
I think, I see the alcoholism symbolism or allegorical elements in a lot of his stories, including Cask of Amontillado, The Black Cats,
right,
several others. He wrote a sort of an essay/story called The Imp of the Perverse about the desire people have to maybe do things that are self-destructive. And like the metaphor he uses there is gazing into the abyss and having this desire to throw yourself in. And I think that's, he was engaging with this idea in a lot of his work and in his life as well. But he also suffered tragic loss. He married his cousin.
A little creepy.
A little creepy, but
also,
not so uncommon.
But during the time, it's hard to kind of have
Well, she was also very Young. We're not going to get into that, but it sounds creepy. But yes, people did marry their cousins back in that day.
But she died of, I believe, TB,
Yes.
which is a disease you cough blood, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of his poetry is dealing with this idea of loss and lost innocence and lost love. And also obsession with women who have been lost. So that's something we see in his work as well. Should we come to his death finally?
Yeah,
His
let's
sort
get-
of sad, lonely, but mysterious and dark Gothic death.
Let's get there. So the city that is most associated with Edgar Allan Poe, even though I believe he was born in Virginia, right?
Yeah.
But he's most associated with Baltimore, Maryland.
I would disagree with that.
Really?
Being from Philadelphia, we have a rivalry with Baltimore.
Okay.
Who has the greatest Poe claim to fame. But he
So,
did die in Baltimore.
he did die in
Which is, I
Baltimore.
guess, the key thing.
And I do think I believe he only lived in Baltimore for 3 years.
Yeah,
so not a
so-
long time.
Screw
But
Baltimore.
I will say there's a football team, American football team named the Ravens, named after Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
Mr. Tony's favorite poem. So
I hate the Ravens. By
yeah,
the way.
but so there are several cities that claim Edgar Allan Poe as their own. But anyways, he did die in Baltimore, Maryland. We're talking about his death, and it's a little unclear of how he actually died. The story goes that he was wandering the streets of Baltimore, and he was brought to the hospital, and he died a few days later. So the fact that's interesting about this is somebody that's like such a mysterious writer, a writer that dealt with horror, has mystery surrounding his own death. So, any theories that you guys have?
So the theories are the fun part, right? Because
I love that he just had enemies, but I'll let you go first, and I'll talk about mine.
I have a version that I've heard multiple times that I believe is the true version, but my version is almost comical. So it's not very fitting, I feel. It's kind of an insult to Poe. So I want to hear your version first.
Mine was just, he was a drunkard, and when when you indulge in such extravagancies, you pick fights with people. You get on the wrong sides of people, and that because of his exorbitant life, this was his downfall. This led to his death. He crossed the wrong type of person, and they killed him.
Yeah. Could happen. In Baltimore, especially.
This is mine. This is my conspiracy.
All right,
theory.
so drunk, somebody does the wrong thing, somebody kills him. Mr. Patrick, what do you think?
I think it was related to alcohol. I do think he potentially... It could have been alcohol poisoning. I don't know. It's hard for me to speculate, but I know he was he died several days later. So I do think something related to alcohol, in my opinion. But I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah. So there are different rumors. One, he had rabies. I like that version.
That's I've
because
heard
it would
that
just seem appropriate. I like the idea of a foaming at the mouth rabid Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think that's true though. So the one I've heard is that so a practice people do when there's an election, and again this is it's what Baltimore people do perhaps specifically. If there's a fair amount of local corruption, they will want to fill up the votes. So what they'll do is they'll go grab people from the street. They'll say, "Here's $5, go vote for our guy," or they will get people who are drunk and they'll buy them drinks and then say, "Hey, go vote for our guy." So what possibly happened to Poe is he was in a bar, he was drinking. Maybe somebody starts buying him drinks. Maybe they even spike his drink, with something that really messes him up. And be careful, students. If you go to college, this can happen to you.
Don't go to Baltimore.
Definitely don't go to Baltimore.
Johns Hopkins is a pretty good school.
Just don't stay on campus. Basically, so they took him around, kept getting him drunk or drugged, took him around to vote in a bunch of different elections all day, and got him drunk and drugged so that he would get their guys into office, and then they just dumped him in the gutter somewhere. And basically he died of alcohol poisoning, possibly in combination with other things.
Wow. Wild night. It's a dark way to end. Any final thoughts about Poe?
The work is better than the life story. I feel like the end. His ending is kind of sad.
Yes.
Although the mystery is interesting.
Yeah, I think Poe is definitely worth reading. And there's a reason why pretty much Poe is, I can speak from experience in American curriculum. There's a reason why Poe is almost required, is pretty much required in every high school curriculum in the U.S. Because he's such an influential writer, and there is a cool aspect of his life, very mysterious background.
I would just say, as a writer, do you believe you have to have a chip on your shoulder, something dark that kind of motivates you to kind of put out this feeling or express this idea?
Yeah. You have to be a little bit different from the norm. You have to have a different set of priorities. Poe perhaps had a desire for fame and success, but his way of getting there was not the traditional way. And so it was, that case of some kind of darkness inside of him that did fuel him and create his best work, but probably also destroyed him at the same time.
All right, so that's our conversation on Edgar Allan Poe. If you would like to hear us talk about anything related to English literature, leave it in the comments. If you've gotten this far in the video, we will make a video if you leave something in the comments about English literature. If we're able to talk about it, we will. So let us know what you think. And that's it for On the Spot this week. Thanks, guys.